I'm Elizabeth Milner, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of the Montclair area. And it is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome you to tonight's program highlighting the second most offensive F word in the English language, the filibuster. Before we begin, I'm delighted to thank our co-sponsors for this program, the Bibliophiles, an African American reading group, the NAACP, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, Montclair Drifters Incorporated, Women of Essex Incorporated, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Montclair Alumni Chapter, the Links Incorporated, United in Friendship, Connected in Science. Thank you, sponsors. For those of you unfamiliar with the League, our most important asset is a strict nonpartisan policy. Yes, we are a very political organization. We firmly believe in democracy and the American people's right to express themselves at the ballot box. We research issues and come to consensus on various issues like voting rights, voter turnout, ease of voting, voter suppression, along with well-researched positions on other social policies, the government, education, and the environment. We are truly a multi-issue organization, but we never support any political party, nor will we ever support or oppose any candidate. We all know that over time parties change and metamorphosize. We remain the same, which makes us targets of one party or the other, depending upon which way the wind is blowing. We've learned this over the course of our 100-year history. So tonight's program will be recorded and will be available to watch on our YouTube channel or on our website or on channel 34. Our website is www.lwvmontclairarea.org. And if you rebroadcast any part of this, it must not be edited in any way and must be used in its entirety. Please stay tuned after the program for some important deadlines for the November 2nd general election. And now allow me to introduce Joyce Harley, a member of our Social Policy Committee, who will introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, Lester E. Taylor III. Joyce?
Well, thank you so much, Liz, and welcome everyone. I am a very proud member of the League of Women Voters, Montclair area, and the Social Justice Committee, which is sponsoring today's event. Everything you wanted to know about the filibuster, but were afraid to ask. The League of Women Voters nationally does have a stated policy with respect to the filibuster, and you can find the actual wording, because it is a little bit long, on the website of the League of Women Voters. But the policy in summary is that we support reform of the filibuster to do away with the tyranny of the majority that is able to stop open debate on an important bill. So if you look at the actual wording, you'll see that that is the essence of it. And I would urge you to go to the website and look at the formal wording and read the entire policy. So it is my pleasure this evening to introduce to you our speaker, the Honorable, and I use that word with all sincerity, Attorney Lester Taylor. Attorney Taylor is a partner, a named partner in the law firm that is not unfamiliar to many of you. It's the law firm is Florio, and I think that name rings a bell with a lot of people. Perruci, Steinhardt, Cappelli, Tipton, and of course, Taylor. He is the former mayor of the great city of East Orange with a long history of representing public and private sector clients at every single level of government. He's very, very familiar. He knows his way. As someone said to me, Lester Taylor knows his way around the State House and the White House. He understands Congress, the Senate, and how they work, and has been a voice for so many people who need to be heard. He's extremely familiar with the filibuster and its history. And so the filibuster does have a very, very checkered and racist history. It was opened up, if you will, back in during and before the Civil War, and was used to basically continue to support slavery across this nation. So I am very honored and very pleased to present to some and introduce to others our speaker for the evening, the Honorable Attorney Lester Taylor. So, Mr. Taylor, the question I get all the time when we talk about the filibuster is, what is the filibuster? Why is it so much in the news? What difference does it make in whether or not we have good government? And I'd like to ask you to open up to explain to us and explain to everyone what the filibuster is and why it's on everybody's lips these days.
Sure. Well, thank you, Joyce, for that very warm and far too generous introduction. I really appreciate that. On behalf of our law firm, all of our partners and associates who I'm joined with one this evening, John Malkow, who will be assisting me with the presentation. We're very happy and pleased to share some time with the local chapter of the National League of Women Voters. I think, to know where you're going, you have to know where you come from. And Joyce, you did reference some of the historical connotations in context of the filibuster. We do have a presentation that I'd like to kind of walk you through to give some historical background, and then maybe we can circle back and jump into some of those questions to the extent they were not addressed in our prepared slide. Again, everything you always wanted to know about the filibuster, but were afraid to ask. Let's move to the next slide. All right. So again, what is it? When does a filibuster end? Why does it matter? How does it affect us? These are all very critical and important questions that were relevant hundreds of years ago. But quite frankly, with what we all see and are experiencing in our country is not, could not be more relevant in this day and age. There's a saying in this business of politics that all politics are local. And so while the filibuster in general is used at the federal level, it's something that, quite frankly, I've seen exercised in my practice with various school boards, municipal councils, and or other public entities where people essentially stall, they delay, they prolong debate, dialogue, and discussion, and in essence, nothing happens. And we'll kind of come back to that in a few. John?
Yes.
Next slide, please.
Yes.
So we have a quote here from the great Vince Lombardi. If you're a football fan, you know him from probably the Jets and or the Green Bay Packers. He has a famous saying that if you can't accept losing, you can't win. He also has another great speech of what it takes to be number one, which I used to always quote when I served as mayor of East Orange. And it starts off by saying winning is not a sometime thing. You don't win once in a while. You win all the time, because winning is a habit, but unfortunately, so is losing. And so with that, we want to make sure we have winning habits, but also understand the teachings of this great coach in that if you can accept losing, you can't win. But when it comes to the filibuster, the opposite is somewhat relevant in that if you can't accept losing, you can win by delay. And that's essentially what I referenced a few moments ago in terms of the filibuster being used as a stall tactic to prolong debate and dialogue to essentially prevent action being taken on an item. John? So what is the filibuster? As I referenced, it refers to a delay tactic. I have to move my screen here. Usually they occur primarily at the U.S. Senate level. A filibuster allows a numerical minority within the Senate. I see someone is showing me the screen. Is that Liz Milner? Is that something you want us to see?
No, I only see John's screen.
No, I can see you. You probably can't see anything else. I thought Liz was trying to show me something. So I'm sorry. I'll keep going. The filibuster allows a numerical minority within the Senate to prevent the majority from bringing legislation to a vote. And we'll get more to the mathematical, numerical calculations a little bit later. In this picture is former Senator Richard Russell, a Democrat from Georgia, who was a former leader of the Southern Caucus. And it was a group of U.S. senators who famously filibustered against civil rights. Again, used delay and stall tactics against civil rights legislation that didn't just affect, Black and brown people, but women, minorities, everyone, many of whom on this call would not be sitting here today if those tactics, were still around today's day and age. Using that delay tactic to secure an unwanted advantage, or rather an advantage, goes back to antiquity, and it is no way limited to the Senate. And as I mentioned earlier, there are numerous other bodies, public and or private. Some of our social organizations probably also use a filibuster sometime when they don't want something to occur. And so it's very important to understand the historical context of that. John? So we have here, in the classical sense, going back to early times, it was used to prevent Caesar from electing a consul in Rome. In that instance, Cato attempted to prevent his success by gaining time. He spun out debate until it was too late to conclude anything that day. I can tell you I have numerous meetings where they start at 6 p.m. and people will argue and debate and talk. And before you know it, it's midnight. And then somebody will say, I'm too tired to make a decision right now. And the meeting will adjourn and nothing happens. And so, and it is a real issue that happens to this day. And in some respects, it is intentional because some of the other members of the governing body who may be in the minority know that people have jobs, know they have families, know they have places to go and people to see in the morning. And so they'll string things out just so that no action can be taken, which in a sense prevents important business from occurring. The founder's intent. So what at first sight may seem a remedy, in some respects is in reality a poison. So again, rather than to encourage cooperation, as Hamilton wrote, the effect of requiring more than a majority, and that's what the filibuster is about, because you need more than a simple majority to pass legislation at the federal level and in some bodies at the local or state level. And so the filibuster, basically, it has the effect of requiring, again, more than a majority, would be to embarrass the administration, to destroy the energy of government, and to substitute the pleasure of regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority. So if it was a matter of a simple 51-49 vote, we probably wouldn't be here. But because many actions require a heightened majority, that's how the filibuster is able to be used as a weapon and or a sword in many respects. And I want to give a special thank you again to John, because he was able to find these great pictures and visuals that you all are seeing here this evening. So again, in some respects, we have people on both sides of the aisle, not just from a partisan politics standpoint, but on either side of the issue in both parties who may be for and or against the filibuster, depending upon, what the issue of the day is. But again, those who defend it argue that it's the political minority's greatest protection against the tyranny of the majority. So if you have a very slim majority, the filibuster, quite frankly, requires bipartisanship. It requires you to reach across the line to get an extra couple of votes. If you watch the news, if you follow national politics now, you may often hear that on just about any piece of legislation that President Biden wants to get accomplished, he needs, I believe, at least 10 Republican votes. So while we may have the majority, we still need 10 votes from the other side of the aisle. And the same would apply if there were a different party in power, so to speak. So in some respect, they say the filibuster helps so that a slim majority can affect what happens for the entire totality of the nation and or the body that might be subject to the jurisdiction of that entity. Critics, on the other hand, they point out that the filibuster was a very effective tool to prevent passage of civil rights legislation. And Joyce so eloquently spoke about that, and we referenced that earlier. Woodrow Wilson, both as an academic and later as a president, denounced the filibuster and began to slow the process of reform. And we'll come back to reform a little bit later on in terms of what we might be able to do in today's day and age. The longest filibuster in U.S. history was propagated by Senator Strom Thurmond in his attempt to stop the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1957. That day, Senator Thurmond, again, a Democrat, South Carolina, he held the floor of the Senate for over a day, and he stood speaking for over 24 hours to stall, to filibuster passage of that act. He began by reading archaic, in some respects irrelevant information, because the reality is he had the floor. And as senatorial courtesy, when you have the floor, you can essentially talk about what you want. So he began reading election laws in alphabetical order. He read the Declaration of Independence. These are election laws from every state for 24 hours. If you read the election law of one state, you'll probably fall asleep. So the fact that he read them from all states shows how adamant he was, and or how adamantly he was against civil rights, equal rights of all people in our country. He read the Bill of Rights. He read pieces of George Washington's farewell address. He coordinated others in that effort to try to string this filibuster out for weeks. In this instance, the only way to end the filibuster was by exhaustion of the speaker. And obviously, after 24 hours, he was not exhausted, or by adjournment of the senator, or by what's called a cloture vote, which is essentially a vote of a supermajority to end debate or discussion on a particular issue. So again, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 ultimately did pass. It was signed into law by President Eisenhower. It was the first civil rights bill to pass since the Civil Rights Act, almost 100 years before that, in 1875. This was the beginning of the the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division at the federal level. And as you see in this picture here, a little bit of local history of our state university. President Eisenhower is pictured in 1957 with our very own from New Jersey, Everett, which is my middle name, Everett Frederick Morrow, who was a Hackensack native, Army veteran, and became the first African-American aide to a president in our country. So with respect to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, again, there was a 54-day filibuster. That's basically 2 months, a 54-day filibuster after the Senate introduced and passed a compromise bill through that cloture vote, which is again 54 days of stalling, of delay, before they had the courage to take a vote to stop that debate, to stop that delay. In this instance, that was the first time that the Senate had ever defeated a filibuster on civil rights. And again, we talked about that on the last slide. John? So we have a chart to your left of the screen regarding the filibuster being a tradition unlike any other. As I mentioned earlier, when a U.S. senator has the floor, they have the right to unlimited debate on any topic, the one at hand or other ancillary topics. The first real limit to this tradition of filibuster came in 1917 at the urging of President Woodrow Wilson in connection with the adoption of a Senate Rule number 22. That rule, again, that's what created or enacted the cloture vote, which at that time required a 2/3 majority vote of the Senate to end debate. In terms of the rise of the supermajority, cloture derives from a French word meaning terminating something. It was adopted in 1917. In 1975, the Senate Democrats had 61 senators, and they amended the rule to require a 3/5 vote rather than 2/3 to end debate. So there's been some change of this filibuster topic over years, again, with respect to the will of the people or the sway of the winds from a political standpoint. If and when cloture is invoked, debate does not end immediately, but it's limited to an additional 30 hours. So, but at least you have a defined end time rather than waiting 54 days, as you saw previously. So some of us have heard the term nuclear option. During the Obama administration, President Obama's administration, the use of the filibuster was weaponized and routinely used to prevent votes on nominations. Once Democrats had fewer than 60 seats in the Senate, essentially the minority could prevent a vote on anything. And that's what's very important to note. I mean, just from a local standpoint in New Jersey, our Senate President, Senator Steve Sweeney, is recognized as being one of the most, if not the most powerful state senators in the entire United States of America. Essentially, there is no bill that can be introduced in the state of New Jersey without the Senate President's approval. So in the Senate, you need at least 60 people. Here, you need one to get something before the elected legislators in our state. And I don't say that positively or negatively. I just say that as stating a fact. In 1975, the Senate Democrats amended the rule to require a simple majority for most nominations rather than the previous 60 vote supermajority. And you see now, whether it be with President Biden, under the former president's leadership, and the predecessors before there, oftentimes you'll see nominees put up for confirmation and they not be confirmed. Or you'll hear situations where the president doesn't even bother putting someone up for a nomination because they know they don't have the votes in something. And so that's typically an act or a function of the requirement to have these enhanced supermajorities in those instances. So the second nuclear option, 2017 to 2021, back in 2016, President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland, many of you may be familiar with that nomination, it was essentially ignored by the Republicans. That they had the Senate majority, and that seat went unfilled for over a year. In 2017, the majority, Senate majority, on the Republican side, they eliminated that 60 vote rule just so that they could get Justice Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. So it's an example of, they don't want it when they're in the losing side, but they want it when they're on the winning side, and that they could be anybody from either party. And that's why it makes it so hard to reform, because many of the laws, or the rules rather, in our federal system are so antiquated that you have to wait so long to get the power. Once you get it, you don't want to give it up, so to speak. And whether that's talking about seniority at the House or the Senate in terms of various committees that you can get on, and or with respect to the filibuster. So again, this margin between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate is now razor thin. We know that. To pass any major legislative goal, again, Democrats need at least 10 Republican votes. You heard me mention that earlier. The prospect of major bipartisan legislation receiving or a swift confirmation of executive nominee is probably, sadly, very slim. You're going to get cooperation on certain issues, but on any seminal issue, the reality is the executive branch has to work darn hard to make that happen. And based upon the partisan nature of our political climate right now, the chances are probably slim. This slide here, and we're kind of moving through this because we want to definitely make sure we have time for questions and answers. We look at the current president, President Biden, his administration with executive nominees. He's got 30 executive nominees that were confirmed within his first 100 days in office. 88 executive nominees were confirmed in President Biden's first 200 days in office. So he's doing some work, making things happen. As of September 1st, a total of this year, a total of 99 executive nominees have been confirmed. So those numbers in a vacuum, they may sound good, they may sound bad, but to add some context to those numbers, we look at the three previous administrations of President Trump, President Obama, and President Bush. You'll see that in the first 100 days of President Trump's administration, he had 19 confirmations. President Obama had 63, President Bush 32. First 200 days, President Trump 89, President Obama 238, and President Bush 240. Upon first blush, and John and I discussed this, we said, well, wait a minute. It almost looks like President Biden is doing better than President Trump did, so to speak, in terms of the number of nominees. But there's a strategy behind that. Many of President Biden's nominees are in safe Democratic states with Democratic senators, and or are of positions or for positions that are somewhat lacking in controversy, so to speak. Whereas the alternative, looking at the former president, in many respects, he didn't bother even putting people up for nomination, knowing they weren't going to be confirmed. And so those are some of the examples that add some context to the numbers that you see before you this evening. So when we look at judicial nominees, 9 of President Biden's 32 judicial nominees have been confirmed. So in some respects, that that's less than 25% or so. Doesn't look that great now, or about 33%, so to speak. Only President Nixon had appointed more judges within the first 200 days of an administration. But again, as I mentioned earlier, none of President Biden's nominees are from states with 2 Republican senators. And so it's in a way strategic, but also in a way leaving out a lot of opportunities for qualified jurists and other executive level cabinet officials from getting an opportunity to serve the country, quite frankly. Other more recent noteworthy filibusters in 2016, Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, filibustered to protest the lack of national action on gun violence after the Sandy Hook shooting. In 2013, Texas State Senator Wendy Davis filibustered an abortion bill for 13 hours, drawing national attention and propelling her to the Democratic nomination for governor in 2014. And I think we're all aware of a more recent abortion-related case out of Texas in the last few weeks. In 2013, Senator Ted Cruz filibustered a lengthy time on the Affordable Care Act, more commonly known as Obamacare. So this archaic rule, this archaic senatorial courtesy is used and in many respects abused, to the detriment of millions and millions of Americans to this very day at our federal and in some instances state levels of government. This slide here talks about, and John, I'm going to ask you and give you an opportunity to explain this slide. We've got a lot of different colored boxes, a lot of numbers running around, but why don't you kind of give us a general overview of this slide?
So generally speaking, the American people are less supportive of the filibuster than, say, the Democratic leadership or the Republican leadership in the Senate. It's the senators and the Senate majority who get to decide what the Senate's rules are, and that's a provision within the Constitution in Article 1. But when the average American, the average voter, is asked about whether they support the filibuster, their response and their level of support for the filibuster changes depending on how you ask the question. If you ask somebody whether they support the filibuster, they're more likely to not know, or they're more likely to be in favor of the current rule, and they're against changing the rules. A lot of Americans, most Americans, are very fair-minded, and they don't like the idea of changing the rules so that you win. If you ask instead whether the Senate should be able to pass legislation with a simple majority, whether majority rule should be the rule, they are much more likely to be against the filibuster and more in favor of a change or a reform to the Senate's rules.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's almost like that question. I became a Seinfeld fan. The show Seinfeld, like when it went on reruns, and there was an episode where Kramer was telling Jerry that he should just write something off on his taxes as a tax write-off. And Jerry ultimately asked Kramer, "Do you even know what a tax write-off is?" And his response was, "Well, no, but everybody does it." And in some respects, in our conversations with Joyce leading up to today's presentation, a lot of people hear the word filibuster. It's the second worst F word I now understand in our vocabulary, but not many people really know what it is. So that's a good analogy I wanted to draw there. So next slide, John. So, as we kind of wrap up and open it up to questions, the questions are all, once you identify kind of what the issue is, you identify, what the problem is, ultimately, the hard part is, what are you going to do about it? Will there be an end to the filibuster? What would it take to change the rules? Again, because as you heard in the presentation, they have been changed throughout the course of our history. But the question is what and or whether we have the political will, the motivation, the incentive to change the rules again. And then alternatively, whether or why we should keep the filibuster. Because as I indicated, if there's a slim majority, maybe you want a little bit more heightened protection so that, the fabric of our country isn't changed, as a result of a one landslide election every 2 or 6 years at the congressional and or Senate level. John? Okay.
This is the last slide.
Yeah, I was looking at that. So I guess with that, Joyce and Liz and others, I'm happy to maybe jump into some questions. I didn't want to take the whole time with slides because I know it's like dinner time, and folks might want to eat and or grab a drink like some of us. But I'm happy to answer any questions and engage in some dialogue with respect to this. Very it might sound boring from a constitutional historical standpoint, but the reality is it's a very exciting topic that is getting a lot of attention across our country.
Well, first of all, before I go, because I do have questions, people have been texting me. Before I go into the questions, I just want to thank you for this very, very informative discussion on the filibuster. I've gotten so many messages from people saying, I didn't know what it was. Thank you so much. This is so informative. This is so exciting. So I really want to give you kudos for breaking down this topic in a way that everybody can understand it. So in terms of a question I have that's come across is, we live in New Jersey. Our senators support either reform or elimination of the filibuster. What more can we in New Jersey do to help move away from the filibuster? How can we be more effective? So that's a question that I've gotten, and if you can take that question, because people want to know, we're already set. So what can we do to help move this this initiative along and support the League of Women Voters position about reform?
Well, I tell you, Joyce, as you know, I'm a lawyer. And so if we were in a deposition, I would object to the form of that multi-part question. If it were an interrogatory, I would object for the same basis, because you had a lot of subparts to that question there.
Touche, sir. Touche.
As I indicated, all politics are local. And not from a partisan standpoint, but just from a standpoint of mobilizing people so that their voices are heard by those who we give the honor and the privilege of representing us in our local town halls, our county halls, our state, and our federal halls of justice. And so what you can do is begin to have dialogues like this. I'm looking at the different tiles, and we have some very influential women who represent a very diverse array of professional and political and civic and social organizations to help get messages relayed to and heard by our federal representatives, whether it be Senator Menendez and Senator Booker, and or our various congressional delegation across the various counties of our state, and then again to our local municipalities. So I think the matter is, letting your voices be heard. And as I indicated, while in many respects the filibuster is thought of as a federal issue, it happens at the local level. And so maybe you can give examples of how, delaying and stalling things at a local level, in many respects reflects a negative trend of the federal level. And that might help the issue resonate more with those who might be able to influence the various levels of government.
Okay. John, I would ask you to stop sharing your screen so we can see Mr. Taylor. And I saw that a question came across from the audience. Another question came across. Susan, can you share that question with us? In the chat, it came through.
Sure. We had a question through the chat, said when and how was the filibuster changed so that the one senator was not the only one to be the speaker, but many are able to do it now?
John, do you recall the top of your head around what time that was?
So,
and if I may also, just as a point of personal privilege, John Malkow is a newer associate at my law firm, and I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that he is a candidate for local office in the borough of Watchung, running for city council at that town. So, he is a advocate in his own right and looking to represent the people in Watchung. So, John.
So, in many respects, the filibuster actually began in the United States Senate in 1805. Prior to that, there was a Senate rule that allowed, like under Robert's Rules of Orders, you to call the question, and you would have to force an end to debate. They, at the time, thought the rule was superfluous, and so they got rid of it in 1805. Then it was more than 100 years later before Senate Rule 22 was instituted in 1917, and that was in relation to our involvement in World War I. And throughout that period and to this day, there have been coordinated efforts by senators to stymie legislation or to prevent action from occurring. So it's been consistent. Sometimes up until I think the 1970s, you could have only a standing speaking filibuster. And that's why Strom Thurmond had to stand on the floor for over 24 hours. And actually, as remarkable as that is, though perhaps not something that we want to applaud, the other senators who were present were actually heroic in their efforts to be present. And they slept on cots on the Senate floor to prevent the adjournment of the Senate and to stop and to force him to continue to speak for that whole time. So it's a more recent change that now senators don't have to speak on the floor. They can simply signal that they are going to filibuster this, and even without making actually engaging in a filibuster, the threat of the filibuster shapes the way presidents and legislators approach their actions in Congress.
Okay. Jeanette,
so in some respects, it sounds like it's easier to filibuster now than it was in the 60s.
It is, decidedly. Senator Thurmond was at the time a Democrat, but he ended up switching parties and went independent and then became a Republican later. But he had to stand on the floor and speak for over 24 hours. He couldn't leave the floor. He couldn't go to the bathroom for over 24 hours. And the other senators had to be present so that there would be quorum. Otherwise, they would adjourn and the battle would be lost in another way, in another form of delay.
Jeanette, I know you have some questions that have come through.
You're muted, Ms. Williams.
Okay, thank you. This information is phenomenal. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I'm education chair with the local Montclair Area League and also a moderator nationally. So I am floored with this information, and I don't know if you can give me an answer to this question. Do you believe tracking the names of the senators who vote to support or vote to oppose the filibuster strategy and circulating that list through social media, online, newsletters, et cetera, will help alert the public?
Well, I think number one, any formal action, any formal motion or bill that has to be voted on, there is a official record. The challenge is you'll probably never be able to you'll get probably 25% of those who are adamantly for the filibuster to acknowledge it, and 25% who are adamantly against it to acknowledge it, and the other 50% will be the politicians they are and not give you an answer. And the reality is they won't have to, because there is no formal action before the Senate to modify the current rules. And so, if and when there is a formal move to change it, well, obviously it'll be codified in the record with the vote. But prior to that, it'll be like watching CNN, and you'll get a good question about the filibuster, and you'll get an answer about the New York Giants. So,
okay.
Right, Councilwoman Walker?
Okay, I'm going to ask people, if you've got questions, to please put them in the chat. But I have a question that's come through in a text message, and it relates to your statement about that filibuster is not just federal, it happens at the state and local level. And the question is, what is the position of our governor on limiting or amending the filibuster now?
I honestly, I couldn't say. I don't know Governor Murphy's formal position, if any, on a federal issue. And I'll just leave it at that. My comments to the local level were more so with respect to my experience. I've been practicing law for 20 years. I represent several school districts. I chair my firm's education practice group. I represent just about every large urban district in the state of New Jersey, from Bergen County down to Atlantic County and as far out as Warren County. And in that, I represent municipalities, bi-state agencies, subdivisions of the government, et cetera. And I was speaking more loosely because every organization is governed by their own bylaws. Some are by way of state statute in terms of what their powers and role are. And others, again, have local bylaws which govern how that body operates. Very few of them, if any, have an official filibuster policy. So I was thinking more from a just anecdotal standpoint of knowing how to the tolerance of the colleagues on the body. Knowing some. What I will say in all seriousness, I had a meeting last night for a school district, and in their bylaws, their meetings start at about 6 or 7 p.m. And they have a provision in their bylaws that says their meetings have to end by 10 p.m. And the only way to extend the meeting past 10 p.m. is by a motion passed by a majority of the body. Now, on its face, people have jobs. They have families. They don't want to be there until midnight, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning at a school board meeting. So it sounds good to incentivize folks to come in, conduct the people's business, go home. But that's an example of how a member of that body could utilize a local form of filibuster by asking a million questions or giving a long committee report or looking for more data, and then it's 10 o'clock, we got to go. And so that's an example of how a filibuster can be used on a local level in a more of an unofficial standpoint. And again, I say that making light of it, but it's a very serious issue. I mean, it happens. I mean, you hear stories of there not being a quorum. So an important contract could not be approved that night because there wasn't a quorum. That's a filibuster. Prior to the pandemic and COVID-19, you had a lot of debate across the state. I would often get questions, and it would always be when there's an important, whether it be a legal contract up, and it could be a 5-4 split, and somebody's stuck in traffic, or they're at the airport, and the question is, well, or they're homesick, they're in the hospital. Can someone phone in to vote? Can they call in and participate with the meeting? And that was an issue before the Open Public Meetings Act was amended by way of Governor Murphy's executive orders to codify the ability for elected representatives to conduct business by remote means. Because prior to that, the Open Public Meetings Act, which governs just about every level of state government, from the state house to the county to housing authorities and school boards, the spirit and intent of the Open Public Meetings Act, otherwise known as the Sunshine Law, was to allow and is to allow the public to observe the workings of their elected representatives. And so some can question, how can I observe something I can't see if someone's on the phone? And so, in some respects, it takes time for legislation to catch up with technology, because I think we all can agree that it's a lot more convenient to be able to call into your council meeting and ask your question or voice your concern than having to go there in the rain, sleet, and snow. So, we'll see how things play out in the future.
Okay. Jeanette, do you have a question?
You have to unmute yourself, Jeanette.
Unmute yourself, Jeanette.
I'm sorry. I was just wondering if Mr. Taylor is aware of any strategies that are in place now that are working to try to curtail this.
John, you want to take that one?
On the federal level or locally, I could speak
Either.
to, so certainly
Okay.
one of the things that has been essential to navigating a filibuster and avoiding it
Yes.
is by structuring your legislative calendar in such a way that you can't have a bill held hostage. And if you imagine that you have a very important tax cut bill and aid for housing and other funding priorities that need to be addressed and that you can't possibly do without, you want to make sure that you're not putting up, say, and this is a real example, a civil rights bill, because what would happen in the 1950s and the 1960s and in all the preceding decades, they would hold hostage all the other bills by filibustering the civil rights bill and keeping everything else in committee. And some of the specific tactics that Mr. Taylor was just referring to that happens at a local level did absolutely occur in the Senate. They would read ad nauseum the Senate record, and they would insist on reading the exact minutes of the previous day. They would, in a vanishing quorum, they would have everybody leave, and then they would have to adjourn. They would specifically try to avoid having people be present, and they would take advantage of the numbers as they existed at that moment to pass votes or to table things or to refer them to committee where everything dies. And so there are specific strategies you can put in place by knowing and anticipating what's going to happen and just trying to know that you're going to face opposition and you have to figure out ways to diffuse it. So what actually happened with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 65 was that they had made sure to push forward tax cut bills, aid to housing, and other administration priorities first, and then only then bring up the civil rights bill, introduce it, and try to get it through the legislative process through committee and onto the Senate floor before the House adjourned. And as you know, there are elections every 2 years on the congressional level, and for the Senate, it's every 6 years. So there are a lot of ticking clocks. And that's why in a lot of these visuals, we made sure to highlight that there's always a clock in a lot of these pictures so that it's all about delay. It's all about playing for time. If you can't do anything else, delay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
I saw something, thank you, Jeanette. I saw something come across the chat. Susan, did you pick that up?
Yes, I can, and I have a follow-up to that as well. So Jean Ellis asked, if the filibuster were eliminated and the Republicans had a slim majority, then the Democrats would lose the ability to block legislation. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the fundamental like gift and curse of the filibuster.
Right.
It's almost like one of those "be careful what you ask for." I'm reminded, and I say this in the best of intent, but it reminds me of like pay to play restriction. Everyone hears about limiting the First Amendment exercise of speech, i.e., contributing money to political candidates. And you oftentimes will hear the reformer, the faction from the grassroots group want to eliminate money from politics. And they enact a local ordinance that limits political contributions from the state limit in New Jersey of $2,600 per candidate to $300 per candidate. And that issue wins the day, and they win, and they become the incumbent. And then they realize how limited they are in raising money, and they hate it. And I say that's the reality of be careful what you ask for.
Okay, I have a
Well,
question.
as a follow-up, Joyce, as a follow-up to that, what I've heard folks who are maybe for the filibuster, takes the devil's advocate, is that does this create a more unstable situation for our government where we're letting the politicians off the hook by not working hard to make compromises that are more middle of the road versus we can go from, one way for 4 years and another way for another 4 years, and we flip back like the Paris Accord. We're in, we're out, we're in. That doesn't seem to be going over well internationally. So is there, that part of it, I think, is potentially a valid argument for the filibuster potentially, or no?
I think that's a very professorial stated question, in a serious sense, because it does require reaching across the aisle to try to reach compromise. And I think it, in many respects, does add a heightened level of stability to our national politics. Now, that answer is not to suggest I'm in favor of it, but I think a practical, unintended consequence of it, if and when it's used right, adds a heightened level of stability so that there aren't a slim majority of people who, in many respects, are only there for 2 or 6 years to change the direction of our country for potentially hundreds of years.
And is it true, I've heard, I haven't done the research on it, but that most other countries are governed on a simple majority? That we are unusual in our position of the higher threshold?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question from an international politics standpoint. I mean, as you're all aware, I mean, very few other countries have the level of democracy that we do. They might have better healthcare systems, but in terms of elected representative capacity, we're probably one of the best. John, do you have any background on that? John was in school a lot more recently than I was, so he might remember this.
It is uncommon to have supermajorities as a requirement for passing legislation. A lot of governments are modeled after ours, and so they'll have a bicameral legislature, and filibusters will still occur. There have been filibusters in other legislatures, whether at the federal level or the national level, that are much longer than Senator Thurman's from back in 1957. There was one that I read about in, I believe, British Columbia that lasted for 34 hours. And there were other ones that were still longer than Thurman's, but not quite as long as that one from up in Canada. So it's a significant problem, and it's a major issue that everybody has to face. It's one of the issues we have that you need to force compromise, but because of how polarized and sorted everything is now, there are very few issues where you can get a huge majority unless you are having a resolution in favor of veterans, puppies, grandmothers, and Congress getting paid.
Oh, that is so rich. Thank you. Thank you, John. I have a question that's come in the chat, and it says, if the filibuster happens in the Senate, is there an equivalent in the House of Representatives?
No. In the House has the ability to make its own rules as well. That's also from Article 1 of the Constitution. And the House has that procedural rule that I mentioned earlier from pre-1805 that the Senate had, where you can call the question. And the Speaker is actually a lot more able in the House to call the vote and to set the legislative agenda than the leader of the Senate. The President of the Senate does not have the power to set the agenda at all. The Vice President is only there to break ties. And in this instance, it's because the Vice President is a Democrat that the Democrats officially have the majority. So it's a very important position, but they don't have the control that the Speaker does.
Okay. Jeanette, do you have a question that's come through to you?
Ms. Williams, you're muted again.
Sorry about that, the delay. No, other than, is there any plan that you would propose? Did we take everyone's question from the chat? Want to make sure we get all of those in.
Looking at,
Yes, yes, we did.
Okay.
So do you have a plan that you would propose? Is there any resolution to this?
Well, a new question just came through. It might be related to what you're asking, Jeanette, is what would it take to eliminate the filibuster?
Okay, good question.
John, go ahead.
It would take a majority of the Senate to approve a change to the rules of the Senate such that you could eliminate the filibuster. So the Senate does have the power to do this. And I think overwhelming pressure from the public and from other elected officials would help. In 1964 and 65, President Johnson really capitalized on the ability, the feeling of the nation to honor President Kennedy's memory, and he pushed a lot of governors and a lot of ministers who were in Washington to go directly to their congressional representatives, to their senators, to directly lobby them, and that was instrumental in getting the civil rights bills of the 60s passed. So the overwhelming public support isn't quite at the level it needs to be to force a change, but there's absolutely an ability to make the change. And Susan, did you want to, I heard your question, but do you want us to address that now?
Well, so you're saying that just a simple majority could change it in the Senate, 51 senators?
Yes. Yeah. So you need less to change it than you need to get someone confirmed. But again, the challenge would be, forecasting the cycle of elections, forecasting, voting districts, etc. What about the day in 5 or 10 years when we don't have the majority anymore? Now our voice is less powerful because they won't even need us if they only need 51 votes versus 60. So I think there's a little bit of, again, be careful what you ask for in that regard, depending on what the issue is.
I'm getting a lot of text messages, and they are, thank you so much, Lester Taylor. This was excellent. I'm so glad that I participated. I learned so much. This is superb. Thank you, John. It was good to see you here too. Thank you, League of Women Voters. I certainly would like to join the league. Again, more accolades and kudos to you, Lester Taylor. I'm not seeing questions. I'm seeing a lot of applauses and clapped hands.
I like this audience. Take you on a road with me.
A lot of thumbs up. I'm just kind of going through just to make sure I don't leave anybody's thoughts out. I belong to another organization. Will you come out and speak to my organization on the same topic? How do I contact you? This is a question. How do I contact you to get you to present to my organization as well? So that is the question.
Okay, so one, Joyce, you have my contact information. You can feel free to share it with the entire membership here. My email address is ltaylor, LTAYLOR, at Florio Law, F as in Frank, LORIOLAW.com. Again, ltaylor@FlorioLaw.com. Feel free to shoot me an email. Joyce, you can send all of my contact information. And between John and my assistant, Susan, and I always say I work for Susan. Whatever she tells me to do, I do. So if you can get through to my assistant, you got me.
And I just want to, for those who came a little later or for anyone who wants to watch it again, it will be on our website. We have recorded this. It will also be on TV 34 for anybody who wants to watch it on TV. Thank you.
Susan, I didn't want to forget about your question, but I think we lost. Oh, no, we didn't lose Lester.
What was the question, John? I'm sorry.
Susan's question was, what plan do we have to reform the filibuster beyond, I suppose, the Senate's vote to eliminate it?
Well, I mean, I would, in my best CNN impersonation, pose that question in a very nonpartisan form to the National League of Women Voters. What do you want to do? Individually or collectively? I think that the answer to that question lies in the minds and the hearts of all of the citizens of our state and our country, in terms of influencing their elected representatives on that issue. As you know, currently you require 51 votes to change it. So, influence 51 state senators and it'll be done. And
I can share the league position. I put it in the chat, but for those who may not be seeing it, the league supports reforming the filibuster to prohibit a minority party from blocking opening debate of a bill. We support instituting a quote unquote talking filibuster, ending silent holds, putting the onus on minority parties to produce 40 votes, and lowering the cloture vote threshold to bring bills to a final up or down vote on the Senate floor.
Yeah, the only other thing I can add that I've heard discussed is you can make more exceptions. There's a lot of discussion now about reconciliation and the budget process as one of the exceptions to the filibuster that allows legislation to go through as long as it's strictly budgetary. if we create more exceptions, then that may be part of the solution.
Yes.
Thank you for answering the question. It's appreciated.
Are there any more questions? I was dropped off all of a sudden and now I'm back on. So this is good. Are there any additional questions, Susan or Jeanette? Because I'm just getting accolades and kudos.
I hope you'll let us see all of those, Joyce.
I think we've answered all the questions on the chat. So It is 7:02. We want to be respectful of people's times.
Do you want me to close?
I think Joyce was going to introduce Lois.
Yes, I want to make sure that everybody gets to meet the chairperson of our Social Justice Committee, who will close us out. This has been an absolute labor of love for our organization to take on this topic because it is so much in the news. And we couldn't have picked a better person to present to us this evening than Lester Taylor. So kudos to you. Again, I'm getting more and more of that. And thank yous to you. So I'll turn it over to you, Lois.
I'm the chairperson of the League Social Justice Committee, which has had since we first formed, two very successful projects. One is this one, which I have to give Joyce all the kudos I can because so much of it, I mean, the committee worked on the ideas and stuff, but she was the one who really got in touch with the speaker and really worked and arranged it and got the date. So thank you, Mr. Taylor, and thank you, Joyce. And I do hope that people will join the league. We have committees that work on a lot of different things. So if you have an interest, you'll be able to do something. And all the information is on our website as far as joining and what committees there are and everything. So I hope that people will and become active. And thank you, Liz, as our president, and Jeanette for helping facilitate this, and Doris as one of our board members, and thank everybody for turning out. This was great. And thank you
Lois.
again, Mr. Taylor and John. It's been terrific. And Susan for being the tech host, which none of the rest of us knew how to do.
Yes, and I think Liz our president had some closing remarks. We don't want to forget about that.
Okay, yeah. Let me just share. This is kind of cute. Here's a question. The last question is, when are you going to run for governor, Mr. Taylor?
Well, I always say that the next office I run for, and I'm in the running now, I've declared my candidacy as of about 10 and a half years ago when my daughter was born, and I'm running for Father of the Year. And I can tell you that she is a very tough constituent. And whenever I say I don't work for her, she says, "Oh, yes, you do." So I have my hands full.
Thank you.
That was terrific, Lester. That was one of the best presentations I have ever seen. Thank you so much for this incredible presentation. And now, as promised before, I just want to give you some important dates to know for the upcoming general election on Tuesday, November 2nd. The last day to register to vote in that election is October 12th. Early voting will begin on October 23rd and end on October 31st. To request a vote by mail ballot, your request must be received by your county clerk by Tuesday, October 26th. You may apply in person to your county clerk up until 3 p.m. November 1st. There are several early voting sites in Essex County, unfortunately, none in Montclair. All of this information and a whole lot more is available on our website, www.leagueofwomenvotersmontclairarea.org. Thanks again to our speaker, our distinguished sponsors who helped make tonight possible, and to the members and friends of the League of Women Voters of the Montclair area. We hope you enjoyed this, this program. Your vote counts. Your vote matters. Don't ever think for 1 nanosecond that it doesn't. This is how democracies die. Vote in every local election, every state election, and every national election. All politics is indeed local. Thank you and good night.
Good night.